War. War never changes. Since Prometheus ventured into the heavens to take flame from the gods, a spark was lit in the minds of many and history would be forever altered. As conflict arose, events would no longer be shades of gray, but instead stained black and white in the annals of history by whoever might be the triumphant victor of battle. But in the end, no matter who would stand victorious at the end of it all, both sides would lose, with the orchestrators of it all equipped with hands bathed in blood. And despite all of its casualties, one war was targeted and was attempted to be conveniently scrubbed from the books, expunged from the mind of the public, much like a group closely tied to this war, and the world so often oppressed. Until now. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the Great Console Wars. All wars inevitably have a catalyst, an event to trigger a chain reaction far beyond the conceivable possibilities initially intended by its action, and this war was no different. 1972, Ralph Baer and team would work together to release the first home video console, the Magnavox Odyssey. Perhaps its name was intentional, with Magnavox truly understanding what they had done, or perhaps, like many catalysts before it, it was simply a coincidence. No matter the case, the Odyssey would go on to be the first voyage in an Odyssey that would unfold over the next 50 years of mankind's existence. The Odyssey, like many modern-day consoles, would connect to a television set as well as come with a very small variety of games, paired with two rectangular controllers. Due to technical limitations at the time, to enhance the graphic fidelity of these games, the Odyssey would include a set of clear plastic overlays to attach to your TV, each meant for a specific corresponding game. Although this practice would widely be considered primitive now, the growth of home consoles would widely be built off peculiar innovation and in some cases compromise. Although the Odyssey would sell a few 100,000 units, it would widely go on to be remembered by few, as not long after its release, other companies and manufacturers quickly followed suit, hoping to reign over a new empire and base of consumers. And here is where we would see one of the first great powers of this war emerge: Atari. Following the release of Magnavox's Odyssey, Atari would draw inspiration from one of the console's featured games, making the first arcade release of the game Pong. Only a few years later, Atari would bring a home release of Pong to households everywhere, and although considered successful, it was not long before the first shot in this war was made. Around the time of the Pong home release, Magnavox would sue Atari for copyright infringement over Pong, claiming it infringed on patents made by the original creator of the Odyssey, Ralph Baer. Baer was effectively able to patent some of the basic ideas of a home console, and for this reason, Magnavox would eventually win the court case with Atari, causing them to have to license the patent for the Pong home console. This case would set a precedent for the war, being one of the first major lawsuits regarding intellectual property in the gaming space. Despite losing this battle, Atari would not be deterred, and in 1977 would release the beloved Atari 2600. And well, as fondly as it's remembered now, it did not initially have success, but after licensing a small arcade game you may or may not have heard of called Space Invaders, the Atari began to skyrocket in popularity. And it would even more so once Atari obtained the license for many other popular arcade games, such as Pac-Man, Asteroid, Centipede, and more. However, while all of this was happening, other companies too began to attempt to break into the market. Beginning around 1975, before the release of the Atari 2600, but right around the time of Atari's home release of Pong, some quickly began to make copycat clones of this back-and-forth tennis-style game, while others tried their hand at making their own version of Magnavox's Odyssey. Manufacturers in Japan, such as Epoch's company, would attempt to break into the market with their own version of Pong, TV Tennis Electro Tennis, but would be shot down before even really stepping foot onto the battlefield, selling an only estimated around 20,000 units. But others would also step forward to challenge the Odyssey and eventually the 2600. Releases such as Fairchild's Video Entertainment System, Mattel Electronics and Television, Coleco's ColecoVision, all attempted to bring it to the home console market, but would inevitably bend the knee to the might that was the Atari 2600. At least for now. Even after the original key player Magnavox would release the Odyssey 2, none were able to truly tackle the giant that was Atari. And while Atari was leading the war in the West, the East would see a rise from a not-so-secret dark horse who had hand in the industry since the beginning of it all. Back during the development of the Magnavox Odyssey, Ralph Baer and his team had reportedly reached out to a Japanese toy company to help design a toy beam gun as an addition to their game lineup for their home console releases. And ironically enough, this toy company, at the time mainly popular for their playing cards and their new line of electric toys, was called Nintendo, who, as you might know, would go on to essentially take this idea in its entirety and be much more widely remembered for their version of the game, Duck Hunt. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Nintendo would slowly over time continue to expand into the video game industry, eventually releasing the Game & Watch, a small handheld console that would go on to be largely successful in Japan, leading to an expansion of the system in Europe and North America. Nintendo would continue to succeed with their production of video games, seeing massive success with the arcade hit Donkey Kong, which would later be licensed for a home release on the ColecoVision, serving as a major competitor to Atari for the first time since its initial domination. However, while all of this was occurring, a great hit would be taken by the industry as a whole, but in particular the United States, when in 1983, a cold, brutal winter would cover the battlefield, leading to what was later deemed to be the 1983 video game crash. Many factors would lead to this lull in the war. Although Atari had had great success, seemingly to be an almost unstoppable force, many had attempted to break down Atari's almost impenetrable front line, and the cracks in their forces were beginning to show. ColecoVision's acquisition of Donkey Kong served to heavily draw a percentage of the market away from Atari, taking an estimated 17% of the total market share. This would of course be worsened only by the release of more and more home consoles, as well as the rise of home computers, all competing to be the sole piece of entertainment technology in families' homes. However, like many empires before them, the true downfall of the Atari empire would begin within. After the large success of the Atari 2600, 4 developers, David Crane, Larry Kaplan, Alan Miller, and Bob Whitehead, responsible for games that accounted for 60% of Atari's sales, would leave the company, feeling that their work was not adequately being recognized. In 1979, the group would go on to form a company known as Activision, selling third-party cartridges that would be played on the Atari system. This would result in a lawsuit, but in the end, Activision would only be forced to pay royalties to Atari, setting a massive precedent for third-party video game developers in the industry. And although this would be the start of the fall of Atari, the real effects of this would only begin to become alarmingly apparent a few years later in 1982. Atari, losing this massive amount of talent, would go on to hire other third-party developers to make games for their now multiple consoles, the Atari 2600 and the Atari 5200. In fact, everyone was making multiple consoles, and all competing to have the largest library of potential games, but with an overall lack of care about the quality of these games were being pushed out left, right, and center, and most of them were fucking atrocious. All of this would spiral into a large crash in 1983, with these companies all forced to try and weather this grueling depression in the hopes they could make it to the other side of this violent winter. And unfortunately, not many would. Atari would suffer massive losses, Mattel Electronics would eventually be shut down only a year later in 1984, Coleco would suffer a massive loss as well, leading to their slow and agonizing death, eventually closing in 1988, and Magnavox, seeing the true horrors of this mutual attrition, would desert the industry altogether, instead fleeing back to work on generalized electronic devices. It would inevitably be a brutal battle, with death not coming from shots being fired from their enemies, but instead from the effects of the industry as a whole freezing over as interest in the market waned. But while the West desperately attempted to survive this frigid storm, in the East, Nintendo had been setting up for a bountiful spring, and they would not be disappointed. While this crash was all unfolding, in Japan, Nintendo would release the Family Computer, or Famicom console. But the Famicom would not go unchallenged, as the company Sega, known previously for their arcade game releases, noticed a downward trend in the popularity of arcades and so decided to take their own stab at the home console, releasing the SG-1000 in Japan on exactly the same day of the release of the Famicom, July 15, 1983, starting a brand new rivalry amongst two previously widely unknown organizations, and from here, the console war would reach new heights of destruction. Despite sales being relatively low for Sega's SG-1000, a recall on Famicoms caused by a faulty circuit in the system was partially responsible for Sega's SG-1000 exceeding sales expectations by 3 times what they had anticipated, inspiring them to continue work on future consoles. Both systems in Japan managed to have great success, with the Famicom largely having succeeded over Sega's SG-1000 while still offering a fairly tough market competition for the Famicom. Having seen the promise of expanding their consoles to a wider market, Nintendo and Sega would both launch consoles in America, with Nintendo rebranding the Famicom as the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, releasing the system in late 1985, and Sega making an updated version of the SG-1000, releasing it in 1986 under the name Master System. Despite having seemingly been beaten to a pulp in 1983 after the video game crash, Atari would seemingly stand right back up at the 9-second mark, staying in the fight to release the Atari 7800 in 1987. Only to be knocked right back out. The NES would dominate the Atari 7800, and although it maybe was a bit harder of competition, would still stand victorious over the Master System as well. After the crash in 1983, Nintendo was able to examine the causes for the crash, and came to the conclusion, just like many others, that oversaturation of lazy, poor quality games in the market was a large contributing factor for the eventual disaster that would unfold. To prevent this scenario from happening again, Nintendo going forward decided to incorporate a seal of approval system for any games put onto the NES as a form form of quality control, also including in the system's hardware a device to avoid third-party applications from running on the device, meaning only those approved by Nintendo could make games for the console. This system allowed for Nintendo to build an almost unbeatable library of games: Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, Kid Icarus, Punch-Out!, Mega Man, Final Fantasy, Duck Hunt, some of these series still easily recognizable today. Nintendo quickly came to be known as a company that produced high-quality games, a reputation that was not easy to tear down. But the war was still not close to over. After seeing success in the video game industry growing again after the NES's extremely successful run from the mid to late 80s, other companies decided it was safe to take a shot again at getting back into the industry. The early 90s would be filled with many competitors: NEC's TurboGrafx-16, SNK's Neo Geo, Philips' CDI, all entering the scene, but these releases would all unfortunately be dwarfed, reduced to atoms among the real competitors: the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES. Previously, the battle between Sega and Nintendo felt like a David versus Goliath situation, and although Sega was able to capture enough of the market to be somewhat respected for their efforts, comparatively they were still nothing compared to the domination of Nintendo's NES. But starting in 1989, things would begin to change when Sega released the Sega Genesis, pushing a direct rivalry with slogans like "Genesis does what Nintendo don't." They were ready for war, and although initially doing only kind of mediocre in 1989 and 1990 compared to the SNES, some dude decided it would be a fantastic idea to come up with a new mascot for the company that would unfortunately be responsible for a corner of the internet most don't like to go to now, only 30 years later. Sonic the Hedgehog would be released to the masses, a true challenger to Mario, aiming to be posed as the cooler of the two in some commercials. And for some reason, this worked, as Sega would cut their prices and push this new game Sonic in bundles of their console, leading to an extremely large and passionate audience of people obsessed with this game. And for the first time in a while, Nintendo's market share had cracked. Sega would undercut Nintendo any chance they got, stealing third-party developers and doing everything they could to antagonize the company, leading to the Genesis finally overtaking a majority of the market share in the United States. Sega had toppled the Goliath, at least temporarily, but the fight was still not over. Although Sega had taken a large control of home consoles, Nintendo's Game Boy was dominating the market as it shifted towards handheld gaming. But in this next generation, Sega at least had a good start for staying at the top of home consoles. However, as the battle began to unfold, it quickly became apparent how vastly outmatched they were. In 1995, Sega would release the Sega Saturn in the US, but that same year, a newcomer to the scene, Sony, would enter the war with their own weapon of mass destruction, the PlayStation, something that was able to destroy any foundational advantage Sega had, and when the Nintendo 64 launched in 1996, Sega's grave was only further cemented. The Nintendo 64 would be able to top the Saturn with close to 32 million units being sold, but compared to Sony, they were but a fraction of the market. A new titan had made its way to the top, and its success was something entirely unseen since the success of handheld gaming with the Game Boy Advance. And heading into the 2000s, this trend was set to continue. Sega was the first to strike, weakly flailing its arms at its enemies with the release of the Dreamcast, a system that would quickly be outperformed by everything else it would release after. In 2000, the PlayStation 2 would release, and just like with the original PlayStation, it would brutally beat the shit out of its competition. The Dreamcast left holding on for dear life as it would be outsold in the end by more than 15 times the number of units as compared to the PlayStation 2. Although the PlayStation 2 did go on to be the most successful home console release of all time, selling 150 million units at the end of its run, Nintendo's GameCube would moderately compete, selling approximately 21 million units, and surprisingly, Microsoft's new Xbox would exceed expectations, selling a total of 24 million units before it was discontinued. Although Sony had the market in a chokehold, Nintendo and now Microsoft still posed a potential threat. In the mobile half of the market, Nintendo would go on to do crazy numbers with the Game Boy Advance, selling more than half of what the PlayStation 2 would go on to sell, beating the total of both the number of GameCubes and Xboxes sold combined. And before Microsoft and PlayStation could even react, the Nintendo DS hit the market, eventually going on to almost surpass the number of PlayStation 2s sold, very closely almost earning the record for the largest console release of all time. Sony would make their own solid effort of capturing a part of the handheld market, releasing the PlayStation Portable or PSP to pretty great success, but still only barely able to reach half of what the DS had sold. But overall, things were still up in the air in terms of who would come out on top of this new generation. But Nintendo was ready to fight. The Xbox 360 would release next, causing a massive upset in the battle and going on to reach almost 85 million units sold, 4 times more than they were able to accomplish previously with the Xbox. The PlayStation 3 would launch in 2006, and it would surprisingly struggle to conquer the 360 despite having such a large advantage over the market previously, and in the end was only able to outsell the 360 by a modest 2 million-ish units. But Nintendo would seize control over both the handheld and home console market, outselling both of Sony and Microsoft's consoles, with the Wii able to capture a large family market leading to 100 million sold at the end of its life cycle. The DS reigned at the top of this totem pole with the Wii closely behind. Nintendo had essentially destroyed its competition. Things had reached a new height of competition, and as gaming was gaining more and more mainstream popularity, things only seemed like they were increasing in competition, complexity, and scope. Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo were all three powerhouses of this space, and with their system-exclusive games, they all offered solid, unique reasons to play their products. But while these three corporations all sat happily on their thrones overlooking the gaming market, a not-so-secret enemy was beginning to threaten them once again, a force agnostic of brand, capable of doing what the console could and more, and only continuing to become more and more accessible. The home computer. Now, computers had always posed a large threat to the home console, and although I didn't mention it earlier, the video game crash of '83 was also largely because of a new competition from home computers. To stay ahead of computer companies, console makers looked to appeal to consumers by offering cheaper devices, better games, or anything to allow for a better gaming experience as compared to a PC that was instead more focused on providing the ability to do a large variety of general tasks. But as both consoles and computers developed, computers only continued to grow in popularity, affordability, and integration into people's everyday lives. The advantage the consoles had began to slowly wither away, but it wasn't quite over yet. It was the early 2010s, and rumors began to spread about what new consoles would be coming in the future. Nintendo, looking to keep their current run of industry domination, were the first to move, revealing the Wii U in 2011. And it was a stretch to say that the Wii U was a new console, at least that's how Nintendo made it look, constantly referring to it in their initial E3 reveal as a new controller, and in many people's minds that's honestly all it was. The Wii U would release in 2012 to overall mixed emotions, with the console feeling less innovative and family-centric as compared to the Wii, and was less powerful from a hardware perspective even when compared to the PS3 and Xbox 360. Although it had an interesting touchscreen controller, most people saw it as a gimmick, and the Wii U would go on to be one of Nintendo's biggest failures. Going into 2013, PlayStation and Microsoft had not announced anything quite yet, but rumors were stirring. Nintendo had almost purposely thrown their lead with how large of a blunder the Wii U was, and now was a moment for one of them to become the new king of the console market. In early 2013, PlayStation would reveal the PlayStation 4 to overall positivity. It was cool, but nothing surprising. But Microsoft fans had no idea the surprises that waited for them. The Xbox One. Almost immediately upon its unveiling, the Xbox One was plagued with marketing issues. First of all, people were confused about the name. The Xbox One? We already had an Xbox One. It's the first one. Why is this the one? What does this have to do with anything? Second, Microsoft attempted to make the Xbox more of a multimedia console with tons of voice and camera features that people definitely didn't view as a massive overstepping of privacy. And finally, something Sony was happy to take full advantage of making fun of, the Xbox One's inability to share games among users. A decision so terrible, PlayStation was able to win this generation with a simple advertisement.
Thanks.
PlayStation.
But even after all of this, Xbox One would go on to still sell an impressive 51 million units, but this was nothing compared to PlayStation's 117 million. The PlayStation 4 had easily won, and though Nintendo was able to unfortunately very easily outcompete PlayStation in the handheld space with the 3DS crushing the PlayStation Vita, PlayStation had effectively remained at the top of this war. But as years passed and folks waited for a new console release, it seemed like the war was truly dying. Consoles still very much had their place. The Nintendo Switch would go on to sell even more units than the PS4, but most people no longer felt the same passion they once had for the home game console. Although not incredibly affordable by some standards, building your own computer or buying one already assembled seemed more and more like a viable option, with people no longer feeling that they really had reasons to buy consoles outside of their exclusives, something that would become less and less common as these companies moved some of their releases to PC. PCs were more flexible, allowed for easy upgradability, better avenues for communicating, and purposes beyond just serving as a game console or device you could use for Netflix in your parents' living room. The PS5 and Xbox Series X would go on to be some of the least sold consoles we'd ever seen from these companies, largely due to manufacturing issues caused by part shortages, and although this was outside of Sony and Microsoft's control, it would unfortunately be the final push for some people to just entirely become PC players. They had lost their grasp on the market, and it felt like there wasn't much to bring people to consoles anymore. The console wars had ended not with a loud bang, but a slow, silent fall into oblivion. And although these consoles still exist and follow-ups might exist in the future, I doubt we'll ever see the market reach what they once had at the great height of this battle. But who knows what the future might hold. For now, we can wait and hopefully retell the stories of these battles so that future generations may learn of what our ancestors truly fought for. Hey y'all, hope you liked that one. I appreciate the views. That's more money for me, and money makes me feel great. Special thanks to these wonderful people from my Patreon who give me even more money. Mads, Dave the Unknown, Griff, Einar Anderson, Turmeric, Maddie Grady, and the commenting cat. Jokes aside, I really do love and appreciate you all. It's very much appreciated. There's probably some new stuff coming for the channel, so stay tuned to hear what might be going on next. Hopefully more content on the way going forward. I'm looking forward to it. But for now, I'm going to stop rambling. The video's long enough as is, but until next time, take care.